Welcome, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here for the salon today, speaking about the historic women's markers and the curriculum that I have developed for the markers. Having been born and raised in New Mexico, I always appreciated the layered history and cultural diversity of this enchanting land. My academic degrees in Southwest Studies and Women's Studies from Colorado College opened my mind more than I ever imagined as a girl growing up in Santa Fe. I furthered my education at UNM, acquiring my K-12 teaching licensure. Teaching and educating in the Santa Fe public schools and multiple state museums led me to my current position at Santa Fe Prep, teaching 7th grade New Mexico history and women's history in the upper school. I approach my teaching through seeking historical stories and voices. By teaching students how to be detectives, developing inquiry and research skills, I create connections between the past and the present. I feel these connections lead students toward new awareness, curiosity, and ultimately taking action. Let's see if this works. Not working. This is a slide of some of the women that my students have researched in the past. And I invite you to think about the images that you see on the screen and see if you recognize any of them. I will reveal them later, not now. So take a moment to take a look, and I will fill you in a bit. Why do I believe the history curriculum needs a greater focus on women? As a student in the Santa Fe public school system, I was inspired by several teachers, one of whom is in this room right now, that use storytelling as a tool in the classroom. My middle school teacher, Kermit Hill, who is here, integrated stories and activities into lessons. Santa Fe High English Lit classes had particular innovative teachers as they placed great significance upon the female authors that we read. Unfortunately, this was not the case in my history classes, and I questioned, where are the women in this narrative? As I pursued my college education, this inspired my investigations into the voices of those not in the textbooks. In fact, my college thesis was about Mary Austin and her time here in Santa Fe. According to a recent memo from the National Women's History Museum, women have long been left out of our national discourse, education, and retelling of our nation's history. Indeed, fewer than 11% of textbook references are devoted to specific women in K-12 state history standards. That's 11%. Thereby portraying women as bystanders to history rather than active participants. In other words, what happened historically and what we know as history are two different things, the late feminist scholar Gerda Lerner stated. A more recent article that I just came upon in the Washington Post, dated January 1st, 2022, reinforces these earlier findings in an opinion article by a high school senior speaking about her AP history class. This was just in 2022. Michaela Wells, she commented on her AP class that the lack of female representation, there was a lack in the curriculum. She mentions a 20-page chapter in a book about World War II, in a section about World War II, that had a single paragraph titled Women. In that single paragraph, there were 100 words, and that was all of the entire chapter about World War II. She stated, I will state her own words, the message students receive is that women are, quote, comparatively worthless. Worse, it's sending the message to girls that their stories and accomplishments don't matter. She interviewed an assortment of students as well, ranging from age 6 to 17, to name someone famous in US history. And the students only named men, with the exception of Rosa Parks, which is great. The follow-up question was to name women in history, and they named Rosa Parks, Harriet Tubman, Vice President Harris, and Amelia Earhart. That was about it. They really couldn't name any other women in history as 6 through 17-year-olds. My students in 7th grade at Santa Fe Prep had the same answers at the beginning of this school year, with a few local exceptions such as Nina Otero and Georgia O'Keeffe. Not only is this indicative of the lack of women that are part of the narrative, but the lack of knowledge my students here in New Mexico have about women in their own region. We frequently talk about the lack of women's voices in my classroom and the lack in our textbook that I use as a skeleton. However, I asked them today to name women in New Mexico's history, and now they can name a long list of women that influenced the story of New Mexico from pre-colonization to present day. There is really one reason why, and it is the New Mexico Historic Women website. I'm constantly modifying my 7th grade curriculum to be more expansive, with creating a focus areas of study that enable my students to connect more deeply with the stories of New Mexico and the women that were a part of that. Several years ago, as I searched for information about unique women who were instrumental in our history, I came upon this website. I immediately began imagining projects for my 7th graders. This is an example of one of the posters that my students created, and we are currently working on this same project right now in my classroom. We spread them all over the campus in the month of March for Women's History Month, and the completed posters, I literally walked out of my classroom to come here, and students were printing posters that we'll put up tomorrow and Friday around the campus and leave up for longer than just March, trying to educate everyone on our campus. With a specified broad topic, the students self-select their research focus from the New Mexico Historic Women website, really based on their personal interests. So they take time to scan through the women, and I'll be showing the website shortly. This allows for them to have authentic interactions with the source as they develop ownership of their learning. This is an example of one of the forms of analysis that I have the students do on the projects, or the articles in the New Mexico Historic Women's Marker website, and then even looking at some of the sources that are used for the articles that are published on the website. This is the soapstone method that we use actually through all of our classes at Santa Fe Prep, all the way up to my seniors who also just completed a soapstone analysis of a document for their projects that they're working on right now. This is an example of one of my students' pieces of work on Little Sister Lawson, who was an Apache warrior. And this is their way of creating the analysis. It's very clear for the students to see each section broken down with the expectation of what they can look for in regard to the speaker, the occasion, the audience, the purpose, the subject, and then what's not on the screen, the tone that I have on the previous. These are slides now of some of the women from the Historic Women Marker program that my students choose to learn about. This woman in particular is also featured in one of the projects that my upper school students have created that you'll see a little later. And she was very inspiring to the particular student, both the 7th grader that is studying her right now and also my upper school student. 2 years ago, I was given the opportunity to develop a Women of the Southwest course that I've been referring to, and I dove headfirst into the current scholarship and resources. Here, I will turn back to the slide of the women that I began with today. These are the women that my students, the first time that I taught this course, studied, and their names are there. I'd like to have a little interaction from the audience. Now that you see the names listed below, I won't tell you if they're in the correct order, going down and across. Raise your hand if you recognize any of the names. And if you would hold up the number of fingers of how many of those names you recognize. If it's 1, 5, 4, how many names do you actually recognize? No fair if you know the inside and out of the Historic Women Marker Program website. So if you all look around at the number of fingers people are holding up, it's also significant. And I encourage you to take a look at the Historic Women Marker website to learn more about these amazing women that my students have studied and that scholars now have access to through the website and the profiles that are on the site. My class of 6 honor level students, seniors, embarked on the journey, bringing endless curiosity about the voices of these women throughout time. Our classroom culture grew, and the students set about the task of examining these women on the website. With dedicated ongoing assistance from our mentors that were working with us, we had women from the Women's Marker program coming into the classroom to work alongside my students on their research and writing. They conducted research in local archives and libraries, and finally wrote a short paper. Their scholarship is now published as supplemental material on the website, and I'm very proud of their contributions. This is an image of us workshopping what we called Fiesta y Cena, the dinner party that we held. Each of the students created for their final capstone project an image of their woman through sharing a meal, the story of their journeys, and spirited conversation was what we kind of thought of as we placed these on a table with flowers and had an event at Prep to really enjoy time together looking at how these women really represented a very broad timeline in New Mexico based on the students' selections. Each student also eloquently spoke at our event, sharing their process, talking about the woman that they had researched, and sharing a bit about themselves as well. These enabled the students to have freedom of expression in a unique modality, which I find very important in teaching, to expand the ways that students are able to express their learning. And other people can also gain from these visual representations, so it also is beneficial to the audience then to learn in different ways other than reading and listening. This is the plates are still showcased in our library at Santa Fe Prep, so if any of you are ever there and want to drop into the library, you can see the plates that represent each of those women, the setting actually that represent each of the women that were studied. As a collaboration with the community, they participated also in off-campus field trips, so I had the luxury of putting students in a van, taking them to museums, visiting archives, and spending time being able to really dig deeply into the research and primary sources on each of these women. Students expanded their understanding of the richness of those primary sources with the bonus of learning about unique career paths as well. As we visited these places, they could speak with someone, a curator in a museum, an archivist, and it also allowed the students to think, there's some different career paths that I hadn't really thought of. So in getting out in the community, it opened more than just their research skills, but also what they were able to think about for their own futures. Here, again, I emphasize the significance of visiting local museums and archives. I wonder if anybody recognizes these are all New Mexico libraries, indoor and outdoor, in the building and outside of the building. I know you probably recognize at least one of them, I would hope, and I'll speak about that. Student engagement comes alive when they participate in this type of research, and as a museum educator in the past, one of the interesting studies that I did as a school tour educator developing programming was that studies are showing that children and youth that visit museums with their classroom within that setting become lifelong visitors to museums more so than visiting with their families. So it's really essential that, I think it's really essential that we start to promote those visits with classrooms. Through the efforts of the International Women's Foundation New Mexico and the support of the New Mexico Legislature and Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, I was provided with funding that was given to this organization to write the curriculum that I developed. This was to forward the stories of the women of New Mexico, the herstory of our women here. I was really, really grateful to be able to embark on this, and it was a wonderful journey to develop the curriculum that I'll be showing you shortly. It's aligned to the New Mexico PED standards for social studies and humanities, so that students and educators can really access these lesson plans very easily on our website to utilize the women's profiles that we have on the website. Let's see, the examples of lessons I've shared today previously are just some of the samples, and now I'll show you actually the website. I think I can, not allowing me to click on it. There. Okay. The website looked very different when I first came across it and started using it with my students. So in addition to, I don't know, it's not loading. In addition to the monies that were allotted to me for writing the curriculum, we also had major overhaul and work on the website with many different scholars and researchers finding supplementary materials. And I'll just scroll a little bit, but then I'll take you directly to the curriculum page. Maybe you recognize some of these women. I'll pause there. There's one I hope everybody recognizes. I felt really fortunate to help design the curriculum page too. Not to just write the curriculum, but to help select the images, the educators that we have here on the feature page. So here at the beginning of the curriculum, we have an introduction that I wrote that gives an overview to the purpose and the kind of the reasoning, but also some basic information about the curriculum. These are banners that we work together with the state librarian's office, and they are available to be checked out by our state libraries, all our libraries throughout the whole state. They are now, some are at the Southside Library currently, or they were. Are they gone now? They're all checked out. Well, they were at the Southside Library. One of my students told me she saw them just the other day. Great. They will be in the Roundhouse this summer, I believe, May through July, somewhere thereabouts. But most of them actually will be on display in the Roundhouse here in Santa Fe. So you can see I organized this according to grade level groupings, and the kindergarten through second grade lesson plans and the third through fifth grade lesson plans I will just briefly talk about. They focus on the theme of community, culture, social identity, responsibility, and justice. So remember, I've concentrated, I wrote the curriculum simultaneously looking at the standards so that I was writing what I knew I wanted to write about these women and create lesson plans that were very accessible to teachers. But as I was writing, I was simultaneously looking at the standards. So I was making sure I was meeting those standards, and I'll show you an example of a lesson plan shortly. One of the other things that I did with my kindergarten and second grade module with the third and fifth grade is these lessons also promote collaboration in the classrooms, because the K2 students aren't able to read the profiles, obviously. And so I have reading buddy type of several different lessons in which it promotes teachers collaborating with each other, so finding a partner somewhere in their school to work together on these lessons. So I had the lovely fact that I had already started creating lessons for my seventh graders. So my 6 through 8 includes the lessons that I created for my students. This Analyzing Your Source uses that soapstone that I showed you. The students create the poster in this first lesson that I created, and then the final is having like a tea with their women that they studied, having an event in their classroom where the teacher really has flexibility, especially also considering resources in different schools to make the lesson really fit what they have and how they would like the students to present and interact. My 9th through 12th grade lessons focus on there are 3 sequential lessons in the 9th through 12th grade, and then a standalone lesson that reaches out in this collective impact. I knew that it was really important to not just recognize women as individuals, and on our markers we have quite a number of groups of women that are recognized as a group. And so I created a standalone lesson for students to look at those groups and to analyze and also think about one of the current hot topics actually with the taking down of statues and looking at changing names and kind of analyzing what's going on currently so that the students could also look at women's memorials throughout the United States also and reach out. I use Glenette Goodacre as one of the examples in this, and they analyze her work. So now I'll show you a few images from the dinner party that I showed you before, Fiesta y Cena. And this is where people can access the students' research papers as well. So if you were to click on one of these, you would be able to read the research paper that the student created. But wait, there's more. And we have someone in the audience today that I'm going to talk about in a moment. I'm currently teaching the Women of the Southwest course again, now at Santa Fe Prep. And it's a really delightful group of 9, 11th and 12th grade students that I've been working with. And through a very serendipitous meeting at a summer art event in Santa Fe, I met Liza McKinnon, who's here in the audience today. And we began a long conversation about creating an endeavor for my high school students. Liza creates costumes using paper, but not just any paper. To quote Liza, historic costumes are fashioned from paper, bespoke garments made with heirloom ephemera. Liza is completing her Whisk Fellowship this week after both creating her own exquisite representation of Ava Scott Fiennes in a gown from 1870, which you're seeing here, as well as assisting my students in creating their own interpretation of a woman in New Mexico's history from one of the New Mexico historic markers. So instead of the dinner party, we are creating Salon de Historia. We began our independent research while working regularly with Liza, visiting the historic Acequia Madre house for a tour of the property and archives, as well as seeing Liza's progress on her project inspired the students to delve into their own research and projects. Some made very personal connections, whether cultural, academic, or familial, or simply just chose someone that inspired them in some way. Through examination of primary and secondary sources again, students each followed the course of a significant woman that impacted the growth and convergence of cultures here in New Mexico. Through perseverance and shared class explorations, everyone created stunning artistic interpretations in the form of a costume that represents the woman they researched. We will have the historic celebration at the Acequia Madre house this Thursday. We will display this collaborative project at Santa Fe Prep campus sometime in the month of April and May, and I invite you to look for that and come by and see the work. I took this slide today, about 2 hours ago, and plugged it into the presentation, and I'm really excited about the students' work on these projects. Yeah. The one in the center is Dr. Wanuka that I had on the screen, and the one just to, I guess it's your left, was actually Anita Scott Coleman that was on the screen before. And the father of the student that created that is in the room with us today. My nephew Miles created that one. We also have a connection with some of these other pieces. We have Laura Gilpin with the pants, the photographer, Georgia O'Keeffe with some beautiful embellishment on the bottom of the gown. And then the one with the primary black is one of the Sisters of Loretto. Throughout this curriculum, students examine the significance of women in New Mexico, specifically focusing on their roles as centering agents in communities throughout history, demonstrating their spirit of independence and influential forms of civic practice and activism. We illuminate the herstory of New Mexico. Many unheard stories will come to life. I am continuing to explore ways to use this wonderful website, and I had the opportunity a few weeks ago to present to the Historic Santa Fe Foundation High School Fellows. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about how I changed things up in using this website just simply for one single lesson and lecture with students that are the fellows for the Historic Santa Fe Foundation. We were fortunate enough to be in the home of the former home of Olive Rush that evening. And these are some images that the fireplace, I took that image that night. And some of these I have used over the years. Coincidentally, Olive Rush, I found out that I was presenting there, but she happens to be one of the reasons that I took an interest in combining my studies of New Mexico and the broader Southwest region in pursuing women's studies as well. So as a young child, I visited the public library building on a regular basis, and I gazed upon these murals. I didn't know who created these scenes at that time, but I was really enamored by her work in the museum, in the library. I really think that seated in that space attached me to that place-based history that I have such a fondness for now. Something about her style drew me into a world of wonder, and I have chased her story and the story of other women ever since. The students were provided, the fellows were provided in advance with a few articles to read ahead of time. I focused this on historic preservation, but also looking at cultural preservation as a piece of that and how to really bring those two together. So again, looking at some of the research, I shared a couple of articles for the students to read in advance, and with the idea that they would explore women that were leaders in historic preservation. One of the articles that I noted discussed the fact that women were kind of in the forefront, but most of that was through funding of historic preservation, women of means in the 1800s, and also just stepping forward, say, with promoting the national parks and in other ways. Primarily groups of women were doing this, working towards historic preservation during that time. By the 1900s, women were beginning to work to include women's history through historic preservation efforts. A variety of women's organizations led these initiatives, as I mentioned. But one of the things that happened was the Great Depression, and that really kind of ended some of that funding and the work that those women were doing because they turned their attention to the war effort. But as I pointed out to my students, or the students, at this point in the exploration, I pointed out that women in the Southwest were working as part of the WPA. And I used this example of Estela Garcia, who's also one of the women on our women's markers, as an example of somebody that revived Spanish colonial tradition of culture embroidery and taught it to women in spaces, community-based art centers. So working to then provide work and art as part of that WA period. Returning to the timeline with those students, we looked at the resurgence of attention toward women being represented in historic sites and buildings in the 1970s, with the growth in the field of American women's history during the 70s. Feminism. Issues such as stereotypes and generalizations, lack of representation, and incomplete narratives became more obvious during this time. The expansion of historic information about women through scholarly studies and investigations began to be linked to actual locations and buildings where these women lived. With this continuing to grow, organizations and initiatives need to continue, today I believe, need to continue making connections with the narratives and places where the stories carry meaning. In other words, place-based history. I asked the fellows to consider the idea that preservation is beyond the physical built environment and inclusive of other attributes of a culture. How women cultivated and preserved culture and in turn expanded the narrative of women in historic places and moments in time. As you all know, we have many examples of this in Santa Fe, including the Three Wise Women and at the Acequia Madre House. And I shared this with the students to consider. The cultural preservation endeavor opens up opportunities for people to explore and learn more about a wide variety of women here in New Mexico. In advance of my presentation to the students, I also asked that they select a woman from the website. So this is tying the research that I did, the articles I had the students read, to them also exploring the website. And because a user can look at different categories, they were able to just click into the category of cultural preservation and scan through the women that fall in that category. So I asked them to each pick somebody to bring back to the table in our conversation during the lecture. One of the examples that one of the students selected was Fabiola Cabeza de Vaca Gilbert, who started the La Sociedad Folclórica. She was so dedicated to preserving the Hispanic tradition. So I found that really interesting that the students were reaching deeply into this assignment, and we had a wonderful conversation. Another is Myra Ellen Jenkins, and I have a personal connection. She assisted me actually in doing the research for my college thesis. So it was, I won't date myself, you can kind of guess. It was in the later part of her life for sure. When I was attending Colorado College, and Myra Ellen worked directly with the students at CC when we were here in Santa Fe on our research. But I think I just admire her so much because she was the first state historian. And I want to read what's on our website about her. The first state historian, she was an authority and expert witness on Pueblo Indian issues and assisted many Pueblos in trying to either retain or regain title to their ancestral lands. Teacher, scholar, and friend, her independent thinking, forthright opinions, feisty wit, yes, definitely, made an impact on all that she met. Finally, another one of the students selected Esther Martinez, who really can be credited with rescuing Tewa language and working so hard for her pueblo in preservation of indigenous language and cultures. We closed the evening discussion by revisiting one of the assigned readings, applying what we learned about women in New Mexico to the following list of ways women can be placed in the historic narrative. So I think it's really interesting to look at the list here and consider how we can all even do this ourselves and how students can apply this. I have not done this yet, but I'm going to make a poster and put it up in my classroom. There exists a rich tradition and history regarding the roles of women in the American Southwest. The voices and stories of women as the creators of culture, whether by hearth and home or through a departure from the confines of societal expectations, are presented in the She Who Shaped New Mexico curriculum. I invite you to join the journey in celebrating New Mexico's trailblazing women in order to educate, inspire, and empower those who follow. Thank you.